This eerie-looking atmosphere is a high school for boys in Japan called Suzuran Boys High School. At the top of the school, we see a young man named Genji Tayaka standing in front of a wall covered with graffiti. Genji is the son of the most powerful Yakuza boss in the region. He crosses the name of a student, Tamao Shirazawa, who is considered the most powerful student in Suruzan High School, and writes his name over it. This indicates that he has great ambitions to conquer all students at Suruzan High School and become the sole ruler of the school. It seems that the students in this school did not fear their teachers or any kind of authority for that matter. The students have always been fighting and creating chaos without being bound by any rules. Eventually, this event also becomes chaotic after a new student makes a fuss that angers another student, a young man named Hiromi Kirishima, who openly challenges a new student to a fight with him. In an instant, chaos ensues and clashes were inevitable until the students are surprised by the appearance of Yakuza members in their school compound. Turns out they're there to take revenge on a Suzuran High School student named Tamao Shirazawa. Kurôzu is a movie about a transfer student named Genji who wants to rule the school of crows, the Suzuran High School. At the advice of Ken, a low-ranking Yakuza, Genji starts to muster together a gang of his own, and as he grows into a true leader, he faces the ultimate battle with the current leader of the Suzuran, Tamao Shirazawa. Watch how Genji turns from new transfer student into a direct threat to Shirazawa's influence. Now back to the video. The Yakuza is represented by Ken Katagiri, who states that Shirazawa had beaten one of their members brutally and had to experience intensive treatment at the hospital. However, Ken is considered to lack charisma and not show the appearance of the Yakuza who is known to be violent and cruel. So he's asked to step back and go buy drinks for his friends instead. In contrast, other Yakuza members try to find Shirazawa's whereabouts at the school. Meanwhile, Shirazawa is seen at the hospital to pick up his best friend, a young man named Tokio Tatsukawa, who is diagnosed with a cerebral aneurysm that requires him to undergo surgery soon. Tokio shows himself looking fine in front of Shirazawa, so his best friend doesn't have to worry about him. But Shirazawa found out about Tokio's health condition, which requires immediate surgery to save his life. When going back to school, Shirazawa borrows Tokio's motorbike, even though he wasn't very good at riding it. As a result, he crashes the bike and later gets into a chase with a policeman, a man named Yoshinobu. The officer is hunting him since Shirazawa is responsible for admitting the Yakuza member to the hospital. However, Shirazawa manages to evade the police and manages to overturn Yoshinobu's car, causing him to get injured in the head. Meanwhile, at Suzuran High School, the Yakuza can't find Shirazawa and instead they confront Genji, who easily defeats the Yakuza with just a few punches. When Shirazawa arrives at school, he looks surprised to know that Genji managed to defeat the Yakuza on his own. Moments later, Yoshinobu arrives at the scene with other policemen and immediately arrests him. This incident makes Genji realize that Shirazawa was not a random person and was indeed the strongest student at Suzuran High School, whom Genji wanted to beat. Later that night, Genji comes to the nightclub and meets a girl named Aizawa Ruka, a singer at the club, and his crush. Genji then arrives at his house to meet his father, a Yakuza boss named Haido Takiya. In reality, Genji doesn't really like fighting much, but he has ambitions to continue into his father's footsteps, to become a Yakuza boss just like him. He proclaims his ambition to conquer Suzuran, a feat that Haido himself had attempted in his youth but failed. Genji then asks Haido to acknowledge him as his successor if he succeeds in conquering Suzuran. The following day, when Shirazawa and his members are relaxing on the school roof, suddenly Genji arrives and challenges him to a fight. However, Tokio manages to stop Genji and Shirazawa from fighting, as he's one of Genji's best friends from junior high school. Tokio then tells Genji that he must first defeat the younger students from other classes before challenging Shirazawa, and after that, defeat a second-year student named Rindaman, a legendary fighter at the school who is said to be able to overthrow 50 people at once with just his hands. Just then, Shirazawa and his boys have to deal with yet another situation involving the Mikami brothers. But Shirazawa single-handedly beats the bell out of the brothers and sends a strong message to his challengers. On the other hand, when Genji inquires about Rindaman with the other students, they reveal that he's a terrible monster in human form, and Genji can never defeat him. Moments later, Genji finally comes face to face with Rindaman, a tall and burly young man. Immediately, he realizes that he cannot fight this man just yet, so he decides to prepare himself first. After that, Ken arrives at the scene, and thinking that he is Shirazawa, he throws a few punches at Genji. However, Genji easily knocks him out with one light punch, and immediately he feels guilty for beating a weakling. After cleaning up the misunderstanding between them, Ken and Genji finally choose to be friends. They then head to a nightclub where Genji expresses his desire to rule Suzuran High, and Ken happily offers to help him. Following Ken's advice, Genji challenges and conquers students at Suzuran High School, starting from his own class. He manages to defeat a young man named Chuta Tamura, the strongest student in his class. Following his defeat, Chuta eventually agrees to join Genji and explains the power structure at Suzuran High School. He also explains the well-respected student gangs inside and outside the school. One of them is the Armored Front, a biker gang led by a second-year student named Bando Hideto. He prefers to rule the streets and is not very interested in being the ruler of Suzuran High School, so Genji doesn't have to worry about him and his gang. Apart from them, another first-year gang, nicknamed Ebizuka Junior High Trio, is led by Hiromi Kirishima and has two quite formidable members. Chuta explains that he doesn't need to fight Rindaman because he's on another level and has no interest in the fights. As a result, Shirazawa Tamao is the highest authority for now because he managed to defeat the other students and founded a faction called the Shirazawa Army to rule the school. Chuta further explains to them that the Shirazawa Army has many very powerful members, one of which is Tokaji Yuji, the mastermind of the Shirazawa Army. Shuji Tsutsumoto is an expert in judo martial arts. Apart from them, there are the Mikimi brothers from Class B, who have just joined the Shirazawa Army, and Tokio, who is Shirazawa's best friend. Chuta then tells them about a young man named Makize Takashi from Class C. Makize is often seen by Shirazawa, but he's reluctant to join him. After Chuta reveals Makize's weakness towards women, Genji then goes to Ruka and asks her to come to a nightclub with her female friends. Without the slightest suspicion, she immediately agreed to Genji's request. After that, Genji meets Makize and invites him to come to a blind date event called Love Group. That evening, Makize comes with an elegant appearance in hopes of attracting a woman. However, he turns out to be unable to control himself when dealing with women, and eventually, he ends up spoiling Genji's plan. Having no options left, Ken orders Chuta to carry out Plan B, where Chuta will pretend to be a troublemaker and annoy the women. Just as Makize was about to defend the girls from Chuta and act like a hero, Ruka suddenly gets up and stabs a fork into Chuta's face, ruining everything. Unfortunately, Ruka realizes all of this was a mere setup and becomes very angry and disappointed in Genji. Without wasting another moment, she immediately rushes from there. Next, we see Genji crying out of frustration when Ruka gets mad at him, so Ken tries to comfort him. Realizing that all this time Genji was trying to help him, Makize is moved and decides to join Genji and help him defeat Shirazawa and his henchmen. After that, Genji challenges a young man named Izaki Shun from Class D, who is deceitful and traps Genji into fighting alone against him and his henchmen. However, seeing Genji struggle to get up despite being poorly beaten, Izaki is impressed by Genji's unshakable spirit and decides to join him. With Chuta, Makize, and Izaki, Genji then opens up his own group called Genji Perfect Succession, or GPS for short. This makes Ken very happy to help Genji achieve his dream of becoming the ruler of Suzuran High School. When asked, Ken explains that Genji is living his unfulfilled dream as he was once a student at Suzuran High School. On the other hand, Shirazawa is alarmed by Genji's rapid rise to power in Suzuran, but he does not take any action. Meanwhile, one of Shirazawa's lieutenants, Tokaji Yuji, is not so indecisive and begins covertly attacking members of the GPS, starting with Izaki. When Izaki is alone, Tokaji and his henchmen surround him and beat him so severely that he had to be rushed to the hospital for intensive treatment. Knowing that one of his members has been injured, Genji becomes furious and gets ready to face Shirazawa and his men alone all by himself. However, he's stopped by his men, Chuta and Makize, after claiming that they're still outnumbered. Still, this doesn't stop Genji from losing control and attacking everyone who stands in his way from achieving his wishes. He then starts attacking indiscriminately to recruit enough henchmen to get ready to fight Shirazawa and his army. On the other hand, Tokaji is not done with Genji yet. After making Chuta battered, Tokaji then approaches Bando Hideto, leader of the Front of the Armament biker gang, with a plan to kidnap Ruka and further annoy Genji. Tokaji offers some of his henchmen to Bando as long as he's willing to kidnap Ruka and bring her to him. However, he doesn't tell Bando that Ruka is the girl Genji loves. Seduced by Tokaji's offer, Bando agreed to his request. Meanwhile, Ken meets his boss, a man named Yazaki Shoji, a Yakuza boss who turns out to be a rival to Genji's father, Haido Takiya. Yazaki then learns of the friendship between Ken and Genji and then orders Ken to kill him, disregarding the fact that doing so will incite a war between the Yakuza organizations. However, the task proves to be too much for Ken, who has grown fond of Genji and begins regretting his decision to become a Yakuza in the first place. As a result, Ken chooses to save Genji instead of killing him. He then decides to meet Genji's father and provide information regarding the assassination plan against Genji ordered by Yazaki. Before leaving, Ken gives a letter to Hideo telling him to give it to Genji. Meanwhile, Bando and his gang manage to kidnap Ruka and bring her to Tokaji. Genji gets a call from Ruka, who tells him that she's being held hostage by men with skulls on their jackets and that her captors mention the name Bando. Realizing that her captors are the Armored Front, Genji gathers the GPS and proceeds to the biker gang's headquarters. A scuffle between the GPS and the Armored Front is inevitable, and Genji looks very angry because Bando has kidnapped his girl. When Bando finally explains that he didn't know anything about Ruka, they both realize that Tokaji has been playing against them for the personal benefit of the Shirazawa army. However, because Genji and his henchmen have battered the Armored Front, Bando demands revenge and asks Makize to cut off one of his ears as an apology. Hearing this, Genji immediately volunteers to serve the sentence, being the leader of the GPS. But when Genji is about to cut off his ear, Bando stops him and appreciates his goodwill before finally leaving with his henchmen. The GPS gang then goes to the Shirazawa army base camp to free Ruka. When Shirazawa finally appears there, he immediately beats Tokaji for acting without his knowledge. He even berates him for his actions because he involved an innocent person like Ruka. After that incident, Genji and Shirazawa then agree to set the fight for 5 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. The same day, Tokio has a surgery in the hospital. That night, Genji meets his father, who hands him the letter from Ken. Hideo also reveals that Ken saved him from his boss who had ordered him to assassinate him. The next day, Tokio is prepared for his surgery and bravely walks towards the operating room without being escorted by the medical team. Meanwhile, Genji and the GPS finally arrive at the grounds of Sudazan High School, where Shirazawa and his army are waiting for them. On the other side, Ken goes to confront his boss and confidently rejects his order to kill Genji. Back at the school, a fierce battle between GPS and the Shirazawa army is inevitable. Both sides muster all the strength to defeat each other. However, because the Shirazawa army has far more members than Genji Perfect Succession, Genji and his henchmen seem overwhelmed. After a fierce battle, Genji and his gang seem to be dominated by Shirazawa's men. Suddenly, Bando and his biker gang arrive at the scene, who had come there to help Genji. The fight reoccurs and becomes more balanced when Bando and his gang join forces with Genji and the GPS. Then, the fighting continues as both sides are giving it their all to claim victory. Genji and his men eventually make their way inside the building as they need to reach the rooftop where Shirazawa will be waiting for him to have a one-on-one. After a long, exhausting battle with Shirazawa's men, Genji eventually makes his way to the top of the building. At last, they are the only ones still standing and ready to fight, while the others have fallen. A fierce duel takes place between them, in which both of them demonstrate quite a tough physique and strength that surpass the other students at Suzerain High School. However, in the end, Shirazawa falls down and cannot get up again. Finally, he decides to admit his defeat to Genji Takiya. Meanwhile, Ken is seen at a dock with his boss. Yazaki takes off his coat and then asks Ken to put it on. He then fires a few shots at him as he refused to kill Genji for him. Ken eventually falls into the water, and for a moment, it seems that he's no longer alive. However, he managed to survive because Yakazi's suit turned out to be bulletproof, and his execution was a ploy to allow him to leave the organization and live a different life. On the other hand, Shirazawa receives a call from the hospital informing him that Tokio's operation was a success. Several days later, Genji again challenges Rindaman, the final obstacle on his path to ruling Suzerain. But Rindaman expresses his belief that Suzerain can never be genuinely conquered and that there will always be someone left to fight. The movie ends as the fight between Genji and Rindaman begins. But for you, it can be the start of recap night with our channel, so check out this video now.